They thought he was just another loner, an easy mark sitting quietly in the corner. But when they crossed the line, they learned the hard way some battles are lost before they even begin. The wind carried a crisp chill as it swept through the car window, leaving a thin layer of dust on the windshield. Alan narrowed his eyes, watching as the dim neon lights of a roadside diner flickered against the darkness. It was a small, worn-out place, stranded on the side of a deserted highway, a relic of the past, frozen in time. The open sign buzzed faintly, barely clinging to life. Alan turned off the engine, exhaled slowly, and pushed open the door. No rush, no hesitation. His boots crunched against the gravel as he stepped out, the silence of the night wrapping around him like an unseen presence. Beside the diner stood an old gas station, its rusted pumps long abandoned. Everything here felt forgotten. As he pushed open the door, a small bell chimed, cutting through the eerie stillness. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes locked onto him, not with curiosity, not with welcome, but with silent judgment. Alan barely reacted. He had seen these looks before, the kind that didn't need words to convey their meaning. You don't belong here. He took in the scene with a slow, measured glance. The cracked leather booths, the peeling checkered tiles, an old jukebox in the corner that probably hadn't played a song in decades. Behind the counter, a tired-looking waitress wiped an already clean surface, but her eyes kept darting toward a particular group at the far end of the diner. A group of bikers. Leather jackets, heavy boots, dark sunglasses despite the dim lighting. Their postures were relaxed, yet there was an unmistakable air of dominance. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a smirk playing at his lips, nudged his companion, whispering something under his breath. Alan didn't need to hear it. He knew their kind. They weren't looking at him as a fellow customer. They were looking at him as entertainment. But Alan wasn't here for a show. He simply stepped toward an empty booth by the window, pulled out a chair, and sat down. No rush, no concern. Just a man trying to enjoy a quiet meal. But deep down, he knew this silence wouldn't last long. The air inside the diner felt heavier now. The silence that followed Alan's arrival wasn't natural. It was the kind of hush that carried weight, a tension that hung between the walls like an unspoken warning. At the far end of the diner, a group of bikers sat sprawled in their seats. They weren't just relaxing, they were observing. Watching Alan like a pack of wolves sizing up an unfamiliar presence in their territory. David, the leader, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his broad chest. He didn't need to look at his men to know they were thinking the same thing. Tonight was boring until now. A slow, smug grin tugged at the corner of his lips as he nudged the guy next to him. Well, look at that. Seems like we got ourselves a lost tourist. The others chuckled, low and guttural. A wiry man with greasy hair tapped his fingers against his beer glass and added, "Not a lot of his kind come through here." Their laughter grew louder, not friendly, not welcoming, just enough to poke, to prod, to provoke. Alan didn't react, didn't flinch. Instead, he simply lifted his coffee cup, rolling it slowly between his fingers before taking a calm sip. His lack of response only irritated them. David wasn't used to being ignored. He set the rules here. He was the one people answered to. And yet this man, this quiet, unmoved stranger, wasn't playing along. David leaned forward, voice louder, sharper. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Alan still didn't look up. He placed his cup down with deliberate care, as if David's words were nothing more than background noise. The others exchanged glances. Their amusement was starting to fade into frustration. A thick tension settled over the room, the kind that made people hold their breath. One of the bikers, Ricky, let out a dry laugh. "Maybe he's deaf, or maybe he's just too damn scared to speak." More laughter followed, but this time it was different, forced, uneasy, because despite all their taunts, Alan still hadn't reacted, and that more than anything was getting under their skin. David's smirk wavered for the briefest second. Then he stood up. The wooden chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and grating against the diner's heavy silence. The waitress behind the counter went rigid. The cook in the back stopped mid-motion. Alan, still seated, slowly exhaled. He had seen this before. He knew exactly how this would go. David took a step closer, his shadow casting long over Alan's booth. This was his moment to reestablish control. He leaned down close enough for Alan to smell the mix of sweat, alcohol, and arrogance. "I don't like being ignored." Finally, Alan looked up, and in that instant, David felt something shift. Not fear, not anger, just a calm, steady gaze that wasn't the least bit impressed. For the first time that night, David hesitated. The diner felt smaller now, the walls closing in around them as the tension grew thick enough to cut. Chairs scraped, boots shifted. A storm was brewing, and everyone could feel it. David loomed over Alan's table, his presence heavy, his fists clenched tight enough that his knuckles turned white. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to people not reacting, not flinching, not backing down, not giving him the satisfaction of fear. And yet Alan just sat there, completely at ease. David let out a low, humorless chuckle, shaking his head before turning to Ricky. "You see this? Looks like I'm talking to a damn statue." Ricky snickered, leaning back in his seat. The others joined in, their laughter sharp, taunting, but it wasn't real amusement anymore. It was forced, tense. David turned back to Alan, his smirk fading into something harder, meaner. "I'm talking to you." Alan still didn't move, didn't even blink. Instead, he lifted his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and finally set it down with deliberate precision. Then in a voice so calm it made the room feel colder, he said, "I'm just here to eat." A beat of silence. Then David slammed his fist down onto the table. Bam! The silverware rattled. The coffee cup wobbled. The room held its breath. David leaned in closer, his breath hot with whiskey and frustration. "Wrong answer." Alan exhaled slowly, as if he were merely annoyed by the interruption. David clenched his jaw. He needed a reaction. He needed to wipe that damn calm expression off Alan's face. So he did what he always did. He escalated. With a sharp movement, he reached for Alan's collar, gripping it tight. The moment his fingers curled around the fabric, everything changed. Alan moved. Fast. 1 second, David was in control. The next, his wrist was locked in an iron grip, twisted at an unnatural angle. Crack! A sharp, gasping grunt tore from David's throat as pain shot through his arm. His knees buckled slightly, his entire body yanked forward by a force he hadn't anticipated. His breath hitched. For the first time in a long time, David felt vulnerable. The diner fell silent. Alan, still seated, still completely composed, looked up at him and spoke softly. "Let go." And for the first time that night, David obeyed. The diner was no longer just a place to eat. It had become something else entirely, a stage where arrogance had been shattered, where fear now crept into the edges of hardened faces. David staggered back, his wrist throbbing from Alan's grip. His breath was uneven, his pride bruised deeper than his body. He looked around, eyes darting between his crew, searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe permission to back down. But there was none. His men watched in stunned silence, waiting, because this wasn't over. It couldn't be. David's jaw clenched. He couldn't let it end like this. He had been humiliated in front of his own people, in front of the entire diner. And if there was one thing David knew about survival, it was that weakness was never an option. His breathing steadied, his hands curled into fists. "Get up," he barked at his crew. "We're handling this." There was hesitation, but then, one by one, the remaining bikers rose. They weren't smiling anymore. They weren't laughing. Now it was about restoring dominance. Alan, still seated, still eerily calm, placed his coffee cup down, barely making a sound. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the storm was about to break. The first man lunged. Alan moved in a single, fluid motion, like a blade cutting through the air. He sidestepped, gripping the man's extended arm and redirecting his momentum. The biker had no time to react before his own weight sent him crashing into the table. Thud! Before the others could process what had happened, Alan was already moving. The second man came at him fast, fists swinging, sloppy, desperate. Alan ducked, shifted his stance, and drove an elbow into the man's ribs. Ung! The biker crumpled, air forced from his lungs. 2 down. The largest of them tried to grab Alan from behind. A mistake. Alan pivoted, trapping the man's arm and sweeping his leg out from under him. The biker hit the ground hard, groaning as Alan pressed a knee into his back. "Stay down," Alan murmured, not as a threat but as advice. 3 down. The last man hesitated, his hands trembling. He saw what the others hadn't. Alan wasn't fighting. He was dismantling. And that more than anything terrified him. His decision was made. He turned and ran. The bell above the diner door jingled violently as he disappeared into the night. Alan straightened, rolling his shoulders as he glanced around. David, still slumped over a table, looked up at him with something different in his eyes now. Not anger, not defiance, but realization. Alan sighed, adjusted his collar, and sat back down. His coffee was still warm. No more laughter, no more taunts. The diner was dead silent now. The kind of silence that didn't just fill a room, it weighed on it. Chairs were overturned, glass shards glittered on the floor under the dim lights, and the air smelled of sweat, adrenaline, and shattered pride. The once boisterous bikers now lay groaning on the ground, their bravado reduced to nothing. They weren't looking at Alan anymore, not directly, because now they knew. David still sat hunched over the table, his breath ragged, his hands gripping the edges as if trying to anchor himself in reality. The reality that he had lost. Alan, however, stood calm and unbothered. No rage, no satisfaction. He took a step forward, and instinctively David flinched. The movement was barely noticeable, but Alan saw it. They all did. For the first time in a long time, David was unsure. Alan didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't rub it in. He simply looked down at David, his voice steady and low. "I told you to back off." The words weren't cruel. They weren't even a threat. They were just a fact. David didn't respond, because what was there left to say? Behind the counter, the waitress still held the phone in her trembling hand, her fingers hovering over the buttons. But now she wasn't sure if she should call anyone anymore. The other patrons who had tried so hard to blend into the background now watched Alan with something new in their eyes. Not fear, not pity, respect. Alan didn't linger. He didn't need to. He turned back to his booth, pulled out his chair, and sat down. The tension in the room was suffocating, yet Alan acted as if nothing had happened. His coffee cup was still there, still warm. He picked it up, took a slow sip, and gazed out the window, watching as the night stretched endlessly beyond the neon-lit diner. Outside, the world moved on. But inside this diner, no one would forget what just happened. The silence in the diner was different now. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the weight of realization, the sting of humiliation hanging thick in the air. David sat frozen, his hands still gripping the table. His knuckles were white, his breath uneven. But it wasn't just the pain that kept him still. It was the truth settling in. He had lost. Not just the fight, but the illusion of control. Around him, his crew remained where they had fallen, groaning, shifting, but none of them making a move to stand. They had come in as predators. They had left as something else. Alan, on the other hand, stood completely unshaken. Not a single mark on him, not a single sign that what had just happened had affected him in any way. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and placed them neatly on the table. The soft sound of paper meeting wood was the only thing that broke the silence. The waitress behind the counter swallowed hard, her hands still trembling slightly. She had never seen anything like this. Alan adjusted his jacket, then turned his gaze back to David, not with anger, not with pity. Just observation. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice calm, "but you need to learn respect." David clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, wanted to regain some piece of his dignity, but he couldn't. There was nothing left to say. A man sitting in the far booth, someone older with calloused hands and the quiet wisdom of experience, let out a breath. "I've seen a lot in my life," he muttered, shaking his head, "but I've never seen anything like that." No one contradicted him, because everyone in that diner knew he was right. Alan didn't wait for a response. He simply turned toward the door, moving with the same unhurried grace he had arrived with. David, still slumped over the table, forced out a single hoarse question. "Who the hell are you?" Alan paused, his hand on the door. He glanced back, offering the faintest hint of a smile. "Just a guy getting lunch." Then he stepped outside. No one stopped him. And as his truck rumbled to life, every person in that diner knew they had just witnessed something they would never forget. The door swung shut behind Alan, leaving only silence in his wake. Not the usual kind of quiet. This was the kind that lingered, the kind that settled deep in the bones, leaving behind a weight heavier than words. Inside the diner, no one moved. No one spoke. The air was still thick with the aftermath of what had just unfolded. Chairs were knocked over. Glass was shattered. And the men who once thought they controlled the room now sat in stunned silence. David was still at the table, his head bowed, his breath shallow. His hands were curled into fists, but there was no fight left in them. He had spent years thinking strength came from dominance, from being the loudest, from being feared. But now he understood. Fear wasn't strength. Control was. And Alan, the quietest man in the room, had been the one to prove it. The waitress, still gripping the counter, exhaled shakily. She had never seen anything like it. A man who had just single-handedly dismantled a group of bikers, yet carried himself like it hadn't even been worth his time. An older man in the back of the diner, someone who had lived through enough to recognize what he had just witnessed, let out a low whistle. "You should have known better." David barely reacted, because deep down, he knew the old man was right. Outside, Alan's truck rumbled to life. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. He had seen men like David before, men who mistook arrogance for power. Men who only learned their lesson when it was forced upon them. Alan hadn't set out to teach a lesson tonight, but sometimes lessons teach themselves. The truck pulled onto the empty highway, disappearing into the night. Inside the diner, David finally lifted his head, swallowing hard, and as he looked around at his crew, at the wreckage of his own making, he realized something that would stay with him for a long, long time. Alan wasn't just the strongest man in the room. He had never needed to prove it. True strength isn't found in muscles or numbers. It lies in control and patience. In life, the loudest, most aggressive people often think they hold power, but it's the calm, steady ones who truly do. Sometimes silence is the most powerful response. Don't let arrogance lead you to mistakes. Respect others not out of fear, but because it's the mark of someone truly strong.